Good morning. So on Thursday I read chapter 1 to you, and we met Winn-Dixie the dog, India Opal Baloney, a little girl, and we are now about to meet the preacher in chapter 2. Sorry about no message on Friday. Internet crazy things. So today you're going to get a bonus. You're going to get chapters 2 and 3. Hold on. Enjoy. That summer, chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name. I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him how I had, the preacher was, sorry, I also told him about the preacher, there we go, and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie, you're a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping because something was wrong with one of his legs, and I had to admit, he stank bad. He was an ugly dog, but I already loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corner trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception, too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Miss Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer, and he sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room working at a little fold-out table. He had paper spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me we should help those who are less fortunate than ourselves? He said, and he rubbed his nose and he looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding in its shell, in there thinking about things, not even sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We have talked about this before. You do not need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps into the trailer and put his head right into the preacher's lap, right on top of all of his papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, that dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What'd you call that dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if ever I've seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears, and a less fortunate too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher said real soft to Winn-Dixie, and Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. And that's the end of chapter 2. I'm going to add chapter 3 on this same recording, so don't go anywhere. No snacks, no restroom breaks, unless you pause. Then you can come back. Chapter 3. I started in on Winn-Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he really didn't like it. He looked insulted the whole time. He didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was washed and dried, I brushed him real good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard on all the knots and patches of fur that stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back and it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mom. I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her. And I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans. Winn-Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, and he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and he went on talking. I nodded at him and went on talking. He did not do any talking. I talked, said Opal. Here we go. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn-Dixie looked at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what I said? Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn-Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back. But he didn't ever tell me that. He won't talk to me about her. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn-Dixie looked at me real hard like he was trying to say something. What? I said. I stared at him. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn-Dixie looked at me so hard, he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn-Dixie looked a whole lot better. He had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have was cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good and would take care of that, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into sneezing fits every time I started to try and brush them with my toothbrush. And I finally gave up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better. So I took him to the trailer and showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new Winn-Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and he finally looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn-Dixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? Winn-Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and he put his head back into the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said real quick before I lost my nerve, I've been talking to Winn-Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said, and he scratched Winn-Dixie's nose. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things. That's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn-Dixie's head, held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head right back into his shell. One thing for each year that I've been alive, I told him. Please. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed, and he said to Winn-Dixie, I should have guessed you were going to be trouble. And then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said. Sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mother. And that's the end of chapter 3. Isn't it great when the author leaves you hanging like that and you can't wait to see the next chapter? All right, internet's fixed. I'm excited. I will get up and get things going for you, and we will have chapter 4 tomorrow. If you would like to go on to Mac and Via, Winn-Dixie, because of Winn-Dixie, is one of the books that's on there, and if it's available, you can check it out, or you can just open it up and look at the words while I read them to you and enjoy, or just sit back and relax and I'll keep reading the book to you just like we do every day at school. I miss you. I'm glad you get to see my face. I can't wait. Remember tomorrow, Tuesday, 9:30 a.m., log into Zoom, use the code, the access code, and we'll get to see each other. Take care, guys. Love you. Bye.